The Orillia Museum of Art and History is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe. The Anishinaabe include the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy. We respect and observe the long and enduring presence of Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit on this land. Their teachings and stewardship, culture, and way of life have shaped our city's unique identity.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. I want to welcome you to our February installment of the History Speaker Series. And now it is my pleasure to get to introduce the speaker, and then he'll be taking it away for us. So Paul Barber is joining us today. Paul graduated from the University of Waterloo, and his hobby, photography, which I do see many photos on the wall behind you, still a passion I see, provided him with many career opportunities before settling into a post with Ontario Correctional Services. It was during that time that genealogy became a hobby. And Paul, it says, was quite inquisitive and had the need to bring out the inner detective within himself, which I love. So researching and finding all sorts of interesting and surprising facts on Paul's maternal side, the Hendersons, which we're going to get to hear the interesting story of this evening. Paul, thank you so much for being here with us this evening to celebrate Black History Month with us. So I'm going to send it over to you now, and then I will see you at the end for the Q&A. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to share my family story. As they alluded to, the Henderson family was from Orillia, and they had a start prior to Orillia, and that's where my story kicks in. So this is a story basically on how my Henderson side of the family ended up going from Virginia all the way up to Orillia, and why Orillia. Over 30 years has passed since I first caught the ancestral bug. And yes, I spent over 30 years going through miles of microfilm, writing all kinds of snail letters, also now the emails, and checking on documents, some of which I never actually knew existed. After all that time, I was stuck in the mud with my 3 times great-grandparents, knowing little more than the fact that his name was Dr. James Henderson, and the name of 2 of his children, one of which was my second great-grandfather. In the field of genealogy, this is fondly known as a brick wall. Now, the goal was to crumble this wall, and for those that know me, I do not like to bow to defeat. So the family stories that came out of some of my close relatives was the fact that the Henderson family name came from Scotland. That's a typical spot to start looking for a name like Henderson. And the name may have emigrated to the United States and then to Canada from the Highlands in the north of Scotland. I understood that being said, but yet 1% of my ancestral DNA showed that there's some connection to Benin and Togo, which is actually the African slave coast. And to this point, there was no explanation as to why that happened. As you can see, this being Africa, there's that little dip and then dive down towards South Africa. And right in here around Ghana, we have Benin and Togo. And that's where a large number of slaves began their journey into the United States. I knew that even though the data had somewhat confusing, that somewhere someone possibly knew something that would help me break open my family story. So sometimes the key to knowledge is more knowledge. So knowing the history of the area that they came from just kind of sort of helped dig up the knowledge I needed to start taking apart this brick wall. I looked into life in Virginia in the early stages of the 19th century and found that slavery was a big adventure in Virginia. How would that reflect on my Scottish ancestors? And then I began to wonder. The name Dr. James Henderson sounded like a very prominent name, which could mean that he was a slave owner. As I was introduced to the idea that Francis and Joseph were his children, I began to wonder if they were actually products of an affair that he may have had with at least one of his female slaves. This became more of a solid idea, and that the children are 15 years apart by age. So Dr. James Henderson may have been a slave owner, and the children products of interest with his female slaves. I now have a scenario that I wasn't actually overly fond of, yet it was a possible scenario. Well, what do you do next? I Googled sites about slave relations, Virginia history, Black history in the US, Canadian Black history, the Blacks in Toronto in the early 1800s. Any site having a chat section, board for posting questions and inquiries, or anything that I could enter my scenario in a quest for answers. And I did just that. I left no stone unturned. Please remember, I don't like the word no. So anyways, sometimes I tend to go slightly overboard, but in this case, being slightly overboard or not, I won. Oh, never giving up. I did, however, nearly forget that I sent all these emails, and some time had passed. But in December of 2020, amidst the pleasures of COVID-19, I heard from the outside world. A Toronto historian, Guylaine Petrin, sent me a very nice email introducing herself and explaining that she had noticed the Henderson family in some of her research in a similar yet somewhat opposite light. She went on to say that my scenario showed plenty of thought. However, the reason I had no luck finding information on the family was because James and Anne Marie were not prosperous white folk, but simple Black family from Richmond, Virginia. James was also a barber and not a doctor that we had expected. Barbers in that era did minor medical procedures, as well as cutting hair, thus the loose term Dr. James. The floodgates were temporarily open, but now I have Black ancestry. That actually turned out to be a pleasant surprise. And then the skies began to darken after the thrill of crumbling wall passed. I found out so much about this generation, like the names and the lives of my 3 times great-grandparents and their children. I also got to know ever so little about Anna Marie's parents, but the wall again faced me with the next generation of Hendersons and the parents of James. This, I was learning very quickly, was how it was for the Blacks, more so enslaved Blacks in the United States. They were basically an entity unknown to most people. I had that one clue about where my Henderson family came from, as my DNA had indicated that I am 1% Benin and Togo. But I can only speculate that the parents of James became the first Americans in the family. It was the early 1800s when the transporting of slaves to the United States stopped. And it has been noted that James was born in Virginia. So you add 1 and 1, and there's a speculation that the first generation of Hendersons came from Benin and Togo just prior to the generation of James. This was, of course, my new project because I have to know. Where do I start, though? Slave ships had no embarkation lists, and the identification of enslaved lists in enslaved Blacks in the U.S. was almost impossible. So it looks like a brick wall that I've run up against once again that may be a lot harder to crumble than this last one. I don't know whether I got more than 30 years left to do that study. But somewhere about 1794 in Virginia, we know nothing at this point about his parents, but James was born in Richmond, Virginia. And on December the 17th, 1812, James and Anna Marie Holt were married in Powhatan, Virginia, and became the task of creating a new family. As you may see in their marriage registration, which is shown here, the two of them are listed as free people of color and listed at the age of 18. The age of Anna Marie was sworn in an affidavit by her guarantor, Richard Crump. Later on in their life, Richard Crump was just one of the close friends that played an important role in James and Anne's safe delivery to Canada. Nothing is known about how and when James received his manumission. We're assuming that he was the first free person of color in his actual family. The couple settled in the area and began to create a family, which would include 7 boys and 2 girls. The youngest was Josiah Payne, who happened to be my 2 times great-grandfather. As I began to search for more detailed information on James and Anna Marie Henderson, I found very little, and that became very frustrating. Blacks, whether enslaved or free, were poorly accounted for, but through a deeper research pattern, you can actually usually guarantee that you have found their proper family group. One census that I found showed the discovery of James Henderson. I'm sure there's more than one James Henderson in Virginia, even in those days, but others were not named. Just shown as male or female, designated by age groups, and the free people of color. Anyways, the age just showed that they may be the family that we expected, being 9 children altogether and a wife, and knowing basically the dates of birth for each of them, you can pretty well narrow it down to the fact that you've got the right family if they all fit into the puzzle nicely. But there is another unexpected surprise that we found on this in the same entry. The family were shown to be slave owners. And in this case, I am drawn to the assumption that the 2 enslaved women were sisters to either James or Anne Maria. Blacks too were known to be slave owners, usually free blacks owning enslaved blacks, but many ask why. Although there were ever so few who actually owned slaves for the purpose of slavery, most of the free blacks owned slaves that were also family members. A free black man may own an enslaved black woman, who may also be his wife. After a period of time, the owner, via manumission, may then have his wife freed from slavery. Other than the scenarios, blacks own black slaves. One problem often arose for black male slave owners who indeed bought a black female slave, and whether they be a wife or just a close acquaintance, after having the female freed, some left their owners for greener pastures. As bad as this sounds, you can also sympathize with enslaved people who were in search every day for possible ways of finding a free life. So the news of the day in Virginia, the laws of the land seemed disproportionately concentrating on blacks as slaves. And that began to ramp up in the state of Virginia. In the United States, they were having trouble defining blacks as mulattoes and other gradients joined in the mix. Thusly, the United States created a one-drop definition, whereas if any part of your blood ancestry was considered black, then you were as well by default. categorized then as free people of color, enslaved persons of color, or other laws were enacted to basically control their rights and freedom. That one drop rule is one reason that it became quite obvious that our family could very well have been Black, because let's face it, I'm about as far from looking Black as possible, but I obviously have 1% of Black blood in me, and that would make me a free person of color in the United States. Although since 1863, that doesn't make any difference anymore. The idea of teaching Black Americans, whether enslaved or free people of color, to read or write was highly discouraged. And in 1830, it became law. Any person caught attempting to educate any Black could be fined or worse, shot. Black parents began sending their children to schools when it was possible out of the state. And once the state lawmakers caught wind of this endeavor, they again enacted a law of discouragement. This law later in 1830s forbid any Black child from Virginia to return to the state if they were educated somewhere else. For the Henderson family, this law caught James's daughter, Frances, the eldest, in school in Philadelphia. Another difficult decision was for James Henderson, a decision compounded by the fact that Maria had passed away in 1832. So Philadelphia, why did he send his daughter to Philadelphia for education? Early on in the 19th century, many elders became concerned about the education of Blacks in the United States. By the beginning of the 1830s, plans in the Philadelphia area were being made to improve upon the status of the educated Blacks. Philadelphia had the largest population of free colored people in America, and they had a thirst for education. Organizations began to call for improvements in Black education, such as the Free African Society and the Society for Free Instruction of Black People. These groups began to succeed in their wishes. However, the Black backlash from other state governments and many whites made their work more difficult and their goals harder to achieve. With Anne's death in 1832, James became a single father of 9 children, ranging in age between 3 and 16. And anybody that's raising any number of children and having any children in that age group knows that it's a two-person job. It's certainly not a job for one single father or mother, especially trying to balance a career and other activities. He was also tasked with keeping up his career as a barber, as well as his work as an advocate for slaves and Blacks in general. The pressure was mounting, but James had a strong personality and a will to match. The final straw was the law forbidding children of Blacks from returning to Virginia following the education in another state. James's bags were packed, and 3 of his 9 children decided to follow their father to the peaceful soils of Canada. The others spread out across the U.S., from California to Ohio, and at least 4 of his sons followed in his footsteps as a barber. Their journey was documented later in a bit of a fellow traveler. So in most of the documentation that I have for the journey of the Henderson family, it was suggested that the 3rd Henderson sibling accompanied the family on this journey, and that it was said to be a sister. Evidence, however, pointed to the idea that this unknown sister was in fact their brother, Beverly. So that's quite indicative of the problem of having your son called Beverly. I shouldn't say problem, but it's mistaken more than often enough to be a female name. At 13 years old, it made sense that he too would be part of the journey. Not much is known about Beverly's life in Canada, but an application by Beverly to the U.S. State Court of Naturalization in California, dated in July of 1875 to become an American citizen, suggests that he may have been up in Canada up to 1875. He traveled to California to be with another brother. Oh, so this is the wording of the documentation that I received about Beverly attempting to become a citizen of the United States once again. Even though he was born in the States, he lived in Canada for over 30 years, which would make it necessary to redo his naturalization in the United States. And part of the statement here that also helped decide whether this true was Beverly that came to Canada, is said that he was is going to renounce his allegiance and fidelity to all these other people, and particularly to Victoria, Queen of Great Britain and Ireland, of who I am now a subject. So he was a citizen of one of the Commonwealth countries, and of course, the closest Commonwealth country, also being the country that his father and other siblings went to, would be Canada. So I'm assuming that Beverly was the third sibling that traveled to Canada with his father. Once he returned back to the United States, Beverly took over his brother John's barbershop upon his death in 1880 at the Stockton Asylum in California. But shortly thereafter, he sold the business. He continued working his own shop in Chico, California, until his death on November 12th, 1886, at the age of 59. Also, if you know California at all, Stockton is just east of San Francisco, and in today's travel, Chico is about 2 hours north of Stockton. So they became California surfer barbers. This is a quote from the obit of Catherine Waddell, who died in 1877, and the obit was printed in the Globe and Mail. And Catherine, her family traveled to Canada from Virginia, along with the Henderson family. And it says in 1839, her family and another named Henderson, in all numbering 15 persons, left Richmond, Virginia for Canada. Like many others of colored blood, their only reason for coming here was to find a country in which perfect equality prevailed. In those days, Canada was a land of promise to the colored people in the South. It was to them a synonym of freedom, and to it they looked with longing eyes, and risked much and worked hard to reach its shores. The journey from Virginia to the city at that time was no small undertaking. The route followed by these families was a pack boat, and this is a drawing, I presume, of a pack boat, to New York, along the Hudson River to Albany, and then along the Erie Canal to Rochester, whereas they crossed the lake to Toronto. The journey occupying more than a week. It took 4 days in the Erie Canal, and the boats were moving so slowly that many of the travelers were in the habit of leaving them, going into the hills with their guns for pigeon, and when through, they would return to the canal and drop to the boats while they passed under some of the bridges. All along the road, people said that they were going to a rough and hospitable country and advised them to turn back, but they persevered in their journey, and like many others, never found reason to regret it. So we had 15 people traveling from Virginia to Toronto, and we had 5 of those were in the Henderson family. There was James, the father. There was Frances, James's eldest daughter. There was Beverly and Josiah, the 2 younger boys. And there was a James Taylor, who happened to be the fiance of the eldest daughter. As the parade of Hendersons came into the Toronto Harbor, my maternal family became citizens of Canada. This set the scene for Canadian Black history, and also an aha moment that happened when our seemingly crossed paths. So we all remember that James was a barber in Virginia. So as his career continued in Toronto, firstly, he opened a shop in Church Street, but by 1843, he moved his shop to 40 Yonge Street, where he continued to keep men looking good until his death in 1846. In 2018, my wife and I attended the wonderful tribute to Gander, Newfoundland, Come From Away. Following this amazing play, we walked down Yonge Street towards the Union Station to one of our favorite spots to eat, Marché. As we sat at the table beside a former doorway to Yonge Street, I commented on the preservation of the old features of the entryway and also questioned what this place could have been in its heyday. Yeah, you guessed it. We were sitting at 40 Yonge Street. And the aha moment comes in the fact that this was in 2018. And as you remember, I did not find out about the Henderson journey to Canada until 2020, 2 years later. So when I found out that we were sitting in that doorway, and that was the doorway that I was questioning, little eerie feelings, a little tingling down the spine. Yeah, it was kind of a real bizarre moment. So Black history in Canada seemed to be influenced by the Americans, yet it changed as conflicts erupted between Canada and the British and the American colonies. In 1794, 19 Blacks who had military service in the war between Great Britain and America petitioned for a land grant to form a Black community in Niagara. This petition was rejected. However, by 1819, the government established the Orillia settlement near Barrie. During the War of 1812, Black troops aided in the protection of Niagara, and following the end of the war, Black veterans received land in Orillia from the Governor General, despite objections from the Americans. It was also common to see American advertisements in Canadian newspapers searching for the return of their runaway slaves. All who would return these scoundrels were to receive a fair and fitting reward. Finally, in August 1834, the Imperial Act abolished slavery in all the British colonies. This would change the face of slave recovery from Canadian soils, yet other Black hardships still took place. So this was basically much of the beginning of this particular pocket of Black history in Canada. The Underground Railroad ran from, well, there's 2 points of entry in Ontario, through Gananoque area and through the Niagara Peninsula. And we all know that there's a strong presence of Black history in the St. Catharines and Niagara area. This also ran right up the escarpment as far as Owen Sound and that area. As it states here, there was Black settlements in the Oro Township area, down near Chatham, the the Underground Railroad coming through Windsor to Chatham and in that area. There's it's quite a bit of Black history, and it's really worthy of reading up on it. I found a lot of great information about the possibilities for my ancestry, and not only through some of the books, but also through some of the Black historians that are doing research in Black history in Canada. Abe Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, thus ending all that had concerned James Henderson. By this point, he was no longer with us to enjoy the pleasures of the true freedom. However, his strong efforts to find freedom for his family were appreciated for generations to follow. Even as New Canadians, James advocated for the rights and freedoms of Blacks in the Toronto area. And this happens to be a petition that was started by James and his friends, and also we have a signature of James Henderson. And it says, "We believe that such attempted exhibitions of African character are not at all relished or approved by the sensible and well-thinking inhabitants of this community. And your petitioners, as duly shall I never fray." And this is a petition from the members of the Toronto Black community in October 1841, voicing their concerns to the entertainers who, by means of Black facial makeup, are portraying African Canadians. As indicated, James Henderson was one of the key persons presenting this petition. James was perhaps the last Henderson to bear the brunt of American slavery influences, as well as Canadian discrimination of Blacks, which was and still is to some extent in existence. Future generations were not so obvious from the African American descent and escaped the prosecution of white Canadians by their looks alone. They still were proud of their heritage as the Hendersons rose through American Black history and in part through the portions of Black history in Canada. As I stated, I show only 1% of possible Black DNA, but I feel pride from every last heritage represented in my DNA. This is the group that ended up coming to Orillia. The woman in the top picture that's mostly covered is Frances Henderson, James's eldest daughter. And this gentleman here, who was also a free person of color, was James D. Taylor, who happened to be Frances' fiance, and he traveled to Canada with the family. James's daughter, Frances, met a young Black man back in Virginia, realizing that their life would always include each other. James E. Taylor tagged along with the Henderson on their journey to Canada. In December 1840, soon after arriving on Canadian soils, James and Frances were married in Toronto. The Taylors owned property on Queen Street in Toronto, but in 1847, James had sold this property to set his sights on Orillia, a quiet but prospering town on Lake Simcoe. Frances could no longer had concerned herself with her father in Toronto, as he had recently passed away. Plus, Orillia was young, inviting to those with an entrepreneurial spirit. And that, along with the serenity of the location, was what attracted the Taylors to the town. Because of their young age, I should say, Josiah lived with his sister and her family. And I'm going to assume that Beverly also did as well, although I do not see Beverly in any of the very early census. But because of his young age, Josiah, with his sister and her family, and James took him under his wings, teaching him the art of shoemaker's trade. James had purchased a lot on Lot 7 in Orillia on the north side of Mississauga Street East between Peter and Mattedash, where he set up his boot and shoe shop with Josiah's assistance. James later purchased more land to support his business adventures and later became a butcher in town. All of the Taylors were considered strong business persons in the community. James died in 1873 and was buried in St. Andrew's St. James Cemetery, where Frances joined him eventually upon her death in 1906. The youngest sibling of the Henderson clan was Josiah Payne, who was born on July 11th, 1829, also in Virginia. He, again, as a young person, traveled and lived with his sister and her fiance, then husband. But 2 days before Christmas in 1853, James took the hand of a Scottish-born Elizabeth McKinley in marriage. Moving back to Orillia shortly after, Josiah remained as a boot and shoemaker for a short time, and then became the wharfinger, the wharf keeper, at the Orillia dock for the steamship Ida Burton, until the railroads came on board, and he became an accountant for the office for Midland Railway. And in the 1870s, Josiah became a long stint on the Orillia Town Council and for the North Ward until he unsuccessfully ran for mayor in 1889. And then he retired from politics. He was also divisional court clerk beginning in 1882 and eventually passed that position on to his son Richard as he and Elizabeth moved to Victoria Harbor. James passed away in 1906, 1 month after his sister Frances, and Elizabeth remained with her son until passing in 1912. Both of those people are buried just inside the fence line at the St. James Cemetery. So if you go in the gate, they're actually right on the fence line, just on the opposite side of the offices there. Born as proud Americans, at least 4 of the known Henderson brothers died as proud Americans. The aforementioned John and Beverly, along with Richard, who eventually moved to Cleveland, Ohio, and raised 11 children with his wife, Anna Eliza. The last brother we know little about at this point was James Jr. James left Virginia and took up his life residency in Saginaw, Michigan. It appears as though James, like his brothers, John and Beverly, never married. The brothers, excepting that of Josiah, all followed in their father's footsteps in a career of barbering. The Hendersons were strong people, but not without fault. There were pockets of mental health issues that we noted a couple there, other signs of human weaknesses within the generation. But as a family, they showed strength, forgiveness, support, and much love for each other, those in their communities and their heritage that helped build their inner strength. Nothing can help build an understanding of diversified world like coming from a diversified family. So this is where I get the opportunity to do a little bit of name dropping. So coming from Orillia, there are a number of different names that became known in the Henderson family. As the Hendersons grew with the town grew with them. Looking at the names connected to the Hendersons, we can find Melville Miller, the first mayor of Orillia. A distant yet important ancestor, Melville's son Gordon, married the granddaughter of Francis Henderson Taylor. Also, Josiah Payne's grandson married into another prominent Orillia family, the Tuckers. James Allen Tucker was a stonemason on the Orillia Opera House project and served on council and the school board in the town of Orillia. This Tucker side also had a former mayor of Orillia within, married John Benjamin Johnson. His mother was the sister of my great-grandmother, Anne Tucker. Perhaps I'm destined to become the Prime Minister of Canada. I deny that I'm ever going to run as a Prime Minister of Canada. It's not a career for the weak at heart. Perhaps one of the Hendersons' biggest success stories is the three sons of Josiah Henderson, who were all-star lacrosse players in Orillia. And two of them went on to play professional lacrosse in the late 1800s out west in Gary, Manitoba. Colin, James Beverly Henderson, and Richard were all known through the lacrosse world here and across Canada. Colin happened to be my great-grandfather, and as I say, he's the son of my two times great-grandfather, Josiah Payne. So as our family saga closes, I will be moving on to the production of a family narrative for both my maternal side and my paternal side. My research is by no means finished, but it is to the point as to be considered a complete family study. I may see you all in Orillia as I continue my research or filming for the future narrative of the Henderson family. So I'd like to thank everybody for allowing me to share my family story with you. This is kind of a breakdown of the direct line of the Henderson family tree. As they say, it's James Henderson and Anne Maria Holt, who were the original patriarch and matriarch from Virginia. This is a listing of their children. Josiah Payne Henderson being my two times great-grandfather. And they had a great number of children as well. The Hendersons seemed to like large families. Colin Henderson being my great-grandfather. And Colin and Susan Henderson had 4 girls and one boy. Josiah Beverly happened to be my grandfather. He was a thorn between all kinds of roses in that family. So Josiah Beverly had one son, his eldest son, James Beverly, and he had a daughter, Shirley, and daughter, Margaret Leone. Margaret Leone married Jack Barber in Owen Sound and became my mother. And we share that family with my sister, Janice. So I'm asking as well that if anybody has a connection or information on any part of this family, you can contact me at the email below there, pbarber@rogers.com.
Well done, Paul. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. You have quite the family story, and you're so fortunate that you can trace your family so far back, and you've put in the work. So your family will have that treasure now of their story, and that's really something. So folks, if you want to put your questions into the Q&A, then we will pose them to Paul. Paul, I'm going to kick things off while people warm up their typing fingers, and just ask you if someone is looking to start out in genealogy. I mean, as you say, you've broken through several brick walls at this point, finding answers. So do you have any tips or tricks for people who are trying to find their own family history?
My first inclination is to say, don't do it. But the one thing that I found that as I started into searching for my genealogy was the fact that it became ever so addictive. And there's many times that I just couldn't put down a book or a document or a microfiche or microfilm. I just couldn't ignore it because I had to look for that answer. So I would say the number one thing is to be patient, to plan out your research really well so that you don't go over the same tracks that you did over and over again. And take it slowly but surely. And don't forget, there is an outside world there. As you can see in one of the pictures, the earlier pictures of me there, that was my my COVID-19 look, but it very well could have been my look from about 5 or 10 years ago when I was right in the thick of things with my ancestry research. So it really it's really a lot of work, but it's very rewarding, especially when you find things like this.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, going off of that, we do have some questions coming in for you. And Janet actually asks a related question there. And that's, how many years have you spent on this project?
On this particular project, I started my genealogical research, I would say in the late 70s. So I'm looking at probably close to 40 years now. Yeah, obviously go for the parts that are quite obvious and build from there. You have a starting base and then you build, like, as a tree doesn't grow from the top down, the tree grows from the roots up. So it's basically the same in genealogy. You have a base that you start with. And it's been about 40 years that I've been working on that base and then working its way up. I ran into a couple of brick walls, this being one of them, and I never gave up on it. Then it kind of dawned on me that there might be an answer out there that I can find if I try it out. The great thing about the computer age is the fact that there's so many more doors open for us. Mm-hmm. And that was basically what helped me break down this brick wall.
On the note of, so 40 years of research, is that Orillia connection? Does that come in pretty recently within those 40 years that you uncovered that?
No, I've been looking at Orillia for a number of years. I actually had a lady from Orillia that what was it, Joan Pilo? I'm not sure whether that rings a bell, but I don't think she was quite an elderly lady in those days. I would like to think that she's still around, like some of the the elderly. But anyways, she was an immense help in digging up information on my family in the Orillia area. She was glued to the library seats and the photocopy machine, and I'd get letters from her on a weekly basis. So, wow. So I've been looking at Orillia for a long time.
Okay, very cool. So I have a question here from Beverly, who says, did you primarily use ancestry.com for your research?
Ancestry.com is it's a good start for doing research, but it's not the only thing out there. I found that the family search program through Latter-day Saints Church is also a very good source. There's a lot of free sources out there. The government has open census up to 1921 and soon to be 1931. So there's a lot of good sources through the government website. There's a lot of us people in my generation had fathers and grandfathers that fought in the Great War. So there's information on a lot of the soldiers from World War I, and hopefully soon you'll be able to get more information on a lot of the World War II soldiers. So there's all sorts of information out there, and probably if you happen to find seminars and webinars that are offered, you can pick up some of these sources. Googling on the computer also helps. All sorts of places out there to go. But yes, Ancestry seems to be the main source for people.
Okay. Susan says, what do you know about Anne Maria Holt's ancestry?
Okay. Anne Maria Holt. I think I can probably take this screen up here. Is that screen showing on okay. It's on, I've got it on the wrong one. Anne Maria Holt, her mother was also Anna Maria, and I do apologize. There's just so many names, and unfortunately, some of these names kind of escape unless you're talking about them on a regular basis. But the only thing I know about her ancestry is that they too were free people of color from the Virginia area. And if you want to send me an email at that address, I'd gladly send you the names and that I have of her parents. So, but other than that, unfortunately, it's back to a bit of a dead end at that point.
Mm-hmm. So Janet asks, will you be publishing a book on this subject?
I've got 3 books that I'm looking at in the genealogical end of things. Unfortunately, they're kind of family-oriented books. One on the Henderson family, one on the Barber side of the family, so my maternal and paternal families. My 3 times great grandfather on my paternal side donated a portion of his property to the Anglican Church of Canada, and they built a cemetery and a church in the Derby Township, which is just kind of south of Lone Sound. So I'm writing this short history on the church and how it came about, what happened to it, and everything. So, and yeah, I'd like to get more involved. I've actually published one book, and it was a children's book. So I'd like to get involved in something a little more in something that I know more about.
What is the title of your children's book?
My Big Backyard Journal and Beyond.
Okay.
It's just it's a book with photographs that I've done of birds and animals and stuff, mainly in our backyard, but there are some outside stuff, and then there's little blurbs, little poems, and on the bottom of each of the pages.
Wow.
I enjoyed it. I did it for my grandchildren, and then everybody said, "Why don't you get it published?" So I did.
I will have to check our local library for that. That's amazing.
I don't know their local library. I know it's on Amazon and Indigo and a few other spots, and so it's out there. It's just that was in 2013, so it's getting a little old, but it was fun. It was an experience.
Very cool. I want to read you some of the comments that we have coming in as well, and then we'll wrap things up. We have congratulations from More US. Great story. Thank you for sharing. From Dorothy, fascinating presentation. Thank you for sharing. Les Huber, I agree, says, thank you for a fascinating detective story. And that's a great way to put it. Marion Grant, who I mentioned at the beginning. Well done, Paul. Shweyu, incredible work. Paul, thanks and keep up the great work. And many thanks for a very interesting and clear presentation. I love hearing such detailed stories. Congratulations on the results of your hard work, from Julia. All across the country, people are tuning in. We have Doreen as well, who says, I have a line of tailors from Virginia, Essex County, Virginia. So that's very cool.
That's a possibility.
All right. Well, Paul, thank you again. That was a really fascinating presentation. And yeah, I agree with Les, a great detective story. So thank you for sharing with us.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And like I say, it's a better way of facing the diversity problems that we are having today if you come from a diversified family background. And we also have Indigenous and Blacks in the Henderson and surrounding lines. So it's interesting. It really, really kind of hits closer to home. And I appreciate everybody and their great comments. That was very nice. Thank you.